they refused to deny the Torah. They tell the story of her watching each one of her children be unwilling to recant the Torah, and they just kill them right in front of her. Ironically, the initial uprising that gave us the festival of Hanukkah did not start in Jerusalem or in one of the bigger cities. In the town of Moda'in lived a priest named Mattathias in Greek, who was asked by the envoy of Antiochus to sacrifice to pagan idols. Not only did Mattathias refuse to offer sacrifice to foreign gods, he proceeded to kill the king's envoy, and some say a fellow Jew who tried to comply, and then fled to the hills to hide. 1 Maccabees 2, 1-7 writes, "In those days Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Jehoram, left Jerusalem and settled in Moda'in. He had 5 sons, John, who was called Gadi, Shimon, who was called Thasi, Judah, who was called Maccabeus, Eleazar, who was called Abaran, and Jonathan, who was called Apis. When he saw the sacrileges that were being committed in Judah and in Jerusalem, he said, 'Woe is me! Why was I born to see the ruin of my people and the ruin of the holy city, to sit idle while it is given into the hands of enemies, and the sanctuary into the hands of strangers?' For 3 years, Mattathias and his sons would fight guerrilla warfare against the Syrian army, who outnumbered them greatly. He had about 4,000 people. They said the Syrian army was at least 40,000. I mean, we know that they were at least 40,000. It was 10 to 1, the odds, the numbers. So sometimes I write, in enlightening the menorah, we forget that one, if not the most important miracles of Hanukkah, is the fact that a handful of soldiers were able to thwart the efforts of a much larger army. According to 1 Maccabees, Judah and his soldiers were able to reinstate sacrifices on the new altar 3 years to the day that it had been defiled. Now, here's the legend, and I put legend there because it's from the later source of the Mishnah. So I reject it personally. I think it's much later and it's added. Legend has that one cruse of oil found in the temple precincts that had the priestly stamp of approval was found and burned for 8 days when it only contained enough oil for 1 day. This legend is found in the later recounting of the Talmud. The book of 2 Maccabees suggests another reason for an 8-day celebration. In 2 Maccabees 10:1-8, the 8-day celebration of Hanukkah was designed to correspond with the 8 days of Sukkot, which found precedent in the dedication of Solomon and the first temple. So when Solomon dedicates the first temple in 1 Kings 8, he does so on the precedent of Sukkot. It says, since Sukkot was celebrated over 8 days, and it's called tabernacles in a sense, the temporary dwellings, once we now have a permanent dwelling for God, we'll celebrate this over 8 days as we dedicate this temple. So when we came to the rededication of the temple in the time of Hanukkah, they looked back to 1 Kings and said, if 8 days was good enough for dedicating the temple, then for rededicating the temple, 8 days is good. And that was their basis, not some cruse of oil that was found. That's what they write. None of the early sources, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, or the Josephus say anything about a cruse of oil. And you would think if it was this significant and this important, that somewhere somebody would have said, oh, by the way, this is important. You know, you can't have a discussion of the Civil War without talking about Abraham Lincoln. You just got to have him in there somewhere, since he happened to be the president. And he gives the Gettysburg Address, and he signs the surrender. So I mean, you've got to have to talk about the Civil War and not talk about Abraham Lincoln would be a little odd. Same thing with this. If we don't have it mentioned there, it's very, very odd. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier the second oldest discovery, the first oldest discovery now, in 2009, you'll love this, in a town called Magdala, which is up in the Galilee. Mary from Magdala, Mary Magdalene. In the town of Magdala, it had been purchased by the Catholic Church, the area, in the early part of the 19th century. And the Catholic Church set about to create a building on that property that they owned that was going to be a women's retreat center, Catholic Women's Retreat Center. They started digging, and when they did, they found that they were digging over the top of a synagogue, ancient synagogue. And so they were forced to call the Israeli Antiquities Authorities and say, oh, we found a synagogue, which cannot, and they said, well, you can't build here then. It's now belongs to the state of Israel. You build somewhere else, we'll give you other land to do that, but you can't build here. What they found is a block in that synagogue that has a menorah on it. Now, that's the oldest example of a menorah we have. The menorah we have in the Arch of Titus and the menorah that we have in this Magdala synagogue are both 7-branch menorahs. Okay, so that's what we have in both of those. So in the Hanukkah, now here's what I've got to figure out. I haven't been able to figure out yet. Because of this whole, did the Hanukkah come into usage prior to this whole concept of the oil, or did it come in, or was it after? I don't know yet, and I'm doing the research to try to figure out which came first. So there's work to be done yet on that. Because as you know, the Hanukkah menorah has 9 branches, okay? Whereas the traditional menorah, and these are the traditional menorahs, as we find in the Tanakh, in Exodus, have 7 branches. So we have 7 branches. Historically, we have 7 branches in the Tanakh, and archaeologically, we have 7. So I don't know yet whether the 9-branch menorah comes before we get to the Mishnah or if it comes after the Mishnah. If it comes after the Mishnah, I'm inclined to. My inclination is to reject it. That's my inclination, because if it's based on this oil theory, then I have a problem with it. All right. Yes.
The menorah represents the 7 spirits of God.
Yes. Isaiah 11.
So what do we have
And Revelations.
with the 9?
Yeah, that's what I don't know. Like I said, I've got more work to do to figure out which came first.
Yeah.
To figure out, maybe they just said, hey, because it's an 8-day thing and we need a shamash, we'll do 9, and maybe that was before. I don't know. Maybe it was after. If it was to capitulate to this oil theory, then I would say, okay, I've got to reject it and I've got to push it.
This to me shows how that over time,
Yeah.
traditions can bury the truth.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, on both sides of this aisle, I've said that, on both sides of the aisle. See, here's the issue, and this is where we come, this is one of the things that's difficult, is that when those of us who were Messianics inherited this, when we came into this whole movement, we were all basically in Protestantism. Okay, we were in Protestantism, but the problem was, what was Protestantism protesting? It was protesting Catholicism. So our protest was against the Catholic side of things.
And both of those
are problematic.
buried in traditions.
Buried. Not only are they buried in traditions, but we now have Catholic scholars, I've said this, we now have Catholic scholars saying that the systemic traditions of Catholicism, there's both in the writing and in the artwork, it's tons of anti-Semitism. Tons. It's systemic. It goes through the generations. It's not like you can say, well, there was this small time period where we got off track and we were anti-Semitic for a little while. It was an anomaly. It was kind of an aberration. Not the case. This summer, I told you I was in Lacey at St. Martin's, and this lady who's a Catholic scholar did her training, PhD at University of Notre Dame. She's there and she's putting these emblems up on the screen, and she says, I want to take you through Catholic history, and I want to show you how this is a very, very dark chapter. Well, it's not a chapter, it's systemic. She's trying to say chapter, a dark chapter. And it escapes even her that this is, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th. She's going through the centuries, and I'm going, chapter?
The whole book.
This is a whole book. This isn't a chapter, but she's saying chapter, but she shows how, and she says, look at how we portray the Jewish people. Look at what we say about them. She's showing this up on the screen, not me, and I'm going, I asked her afterwards. I said, what do we do with this? What do you think about all this? And she goes, it's just something we have to repudiate and something we have to denounce. She says, I'm not proud of it by any stretch of the imagination. It's there. I can't deny it's there, but I don't have to like it. You know, so I mean, I'll say that for her. At least I don't think that's her, but it's clearly in the tradition. Now, on the other side of it, we as Messianics inherited. We said we want to come back to Torah. Well, the problem is the only ones who've been interpreting Torah for the last 2,000 years were the rabbis. So we said, well, we don't want the Catholic Book of Order. We don't want all the Pope's encyclicals. We reject all of that. So we'll come back and let's go back and see what we can do. And we came back to, and what we found was, well, we got the Mishnah and the Talmud. We're right back in traditions. Now let me say it this way too. I want to be fair on this side of things. Not all traditions are bad. Tradition by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can have good traditions that are biblically based, and you can have bad traditions that are not biblically based. Ones that are based in paganism, and ones that are based in idolatry. But one of the things that didn't happen with this movement early on is we didn't examine these traditions. We just said, well, if it's Jewish, it must be good. Because it's Jewish. And I've been saying all along, I don't want to just have, what's the word I'm looking for? I didn't want to just transfer from one paganism to another paganism. Or from one tradition to another just to say, well, one's Jewish, therefore it's right. As if Jewish tradition or Jewish paganism, Kabbalah, it's all messed up, as if that were better than Christmas, Easter, and all the other nonsensical back stuff that we have in the trunk, all this other junk in the trunk. So Kabbalah's messed up. It's got its problems. Yes?
I can save you some research because when I spent 6 years in the Messianic Jewish synagogue, okay, in Connecticut, and the rabbi was really clear that the 9-branch menorah came about as a way to celebrate these 8 days. And that
But is it before the oil or after the oil?
after, the whole thing after that whole Mishnah teaching.
Yeah.
So he did this whole thing was really clear.
I'd like to see that. I want to see this at work because I want to be able to say
Well,
why.
it's just verbal. He just told it in a teaching about Hanukkah. So.
But I'd love to see I want to see the research because I want to be able to say to people, this is why I'm rejecting this and why I'm going this direction.
He's really clear about the 7-branch menorah is God's menorah, and that this came about as a tradition, as a custom to celebrate, and the whole thing about you have to cook with oil and all of the stuff around Hanukkah, and that morphed into.
Oh man, does that mean I'm going to get latkes and soup oak? Well then, if we're not getting good food, we're going back to the old traditions.
You can do whatever you want.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean.
But I don't know. I could probably write to him and ask.
Yeah, I'd like to find out his research. If he's got research on this, I'd love to know because I think it would be good to be able to say, here's the evidence and here's what we've got. Because I've done the research has been done on the other side with regards to looking at the backgrounds of Easter and Christmas. We've done that kind of research that's been documented, so we can say, okay, these are problems. But on the other side of it, I want to be able to say, hey, look, if this is also problematic or comes out of soil that's tainted. Then so is this, and be able to show documentation. Yeah, no.
The good part of tradition is when they didn't have the written word like we do. The only way that you could send this down from generation to generation is by tradition.
Right, orally.
Orally, yeah. The problem is, as it went down from generation to generation, there's little quirks put in here and there.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, everything gets tweaked and messed with, so that's the way it is. And so I'm just saying this, we all have to continue to, in this movement, one of the things I've been saying is, we've got to go back to the biblical text and say, what does the biblical text say? The one thing we can say is this clearly. If you're going to base it on the biblical text, Exodus would tell you that it's a 7-branch menorah. And the first two earliest archaeological things we have are the 7-branch. Now, having said that, when I don't find this cruse of oil, so let's forget or set aside the issue of the menorah for just a second. When I don't find this cruse of oil in the first 3 earliest sources, then I have to also say, hey, that's legend as well. We have all these urban myths. I'll give you an example. How many of you have heard this one? Raise your hand if you've heard this urban myth before. I'll tell you where it comes from in just a moment. And by the way, the source is not the point in this. How many of you heard this thing that they would tie a rope around the high priest's ankle so that if he went into the holy place, that they could pull him out?
Right.
Yeah.
You know where that's found? I told you before, I don't know if you remember. It's found twice in the Kabbalistic literature, the Zohar. It's very late. It's extremely late.
1700s.
Yeah, go ahead.
When did the tradition of buying into the priesthood, did that continue after the Hanukkah? Or was that just in the time of Christ or what?
Yeah, what happened? Yeah, by the way, so here's what happens. Look at what happens. We're going to celebrate Hanukkah, and the Mattathias